For 1,600 years, a 6-ton spear of pure iron has been pointing at the sky. It has endured scorching heat, torrential monsoon rains, and some of the most corrosive air pollution on the planet. By every law of chemistry, by every rule of metallurgy we know, it should have disintegrated into a pile of reddish-brown dust more than 1,000 years ago. But it hasn't. It stands in the heart of Delhi, India, almost completely free of rust. This isn't a legend. It's not a myth. It is a 23-foot-tall scientific impossibility that has baffled the world's brightest minds for centuries. And the secret to its survival isn't just a forgotten recipe from the ancient world. It's a clue to a level of technological mastery so advanced, it forces us to ask a terrifying question. What other technologies did our ancestors possess that we have completely forgotten? What if this rust-proof pillar isn't the peak of their knowledge, but just a single surviving artifact of a science we are only now beginning to understand? Imagine leaving a solid steel crowbar in your backyard. In a few years, it's a pitted, flaky mess. In a few decades, it's dangerously weakened. In a century, it's practically gone. The iron pillar of Delhi has been standing in an open-air courtyard for 16 centuries. It was forged around the year 400 AD, a time when the Roman Empire was collapsing, a full millennium before the United States would even exist. And yet, it has outlasted empires, survived invasions, and silently watched as the modern world was built around it, all while refusing to succumb to the one thing that is inevitable for iron: decay. To understand how impossible this is, you have to understand rust. Rust, or oxidation, is a chemical reaction. It's what happens when iron atoms meet oxygen and water. It's a relentless, destructive process. It's why we paint our cars, galvanize our nails, and coat our bridges. Modern science has invented incredible alloys, like stainless steel and Corten steel, specifically to fight this process. But those are complex, modern inventions, requiring precise mixtures of chromium, nickel, and copper. The Delhi pillar is different. It's 99.72% pure iron. That level of purity should make it more susceptible to rust, not less. It is a metallurgical paradox. An object that, by its very composition, should be one of the most fragile artifacts from the ancient world is, in fact, one of the most durable. It stands today in the Qutub complex, a UNESCO World Heritage Site in South Delhi. Tourists from all over the world flock to see the towering Qutub Minar, a magnificent 13th-century brick minaret. They walk through the ruins of the Qutub Islam Mosque, the first mosque built in Delhi. And there, in the center of the mosque's courtyard, it stands. It almost doesn't belong. Surrounded by intricately carved sandstone and ancient rubble, the pillar is sleek, dark, and strangely modern. It's a stark metallic exclamation point in a sentence written in stone. It's over 6.5 tons of solid wrought iron, forged with a skill that experts believed was impossible for that era. To create a single, uniform piece of iron this large would have required heating and hammer welding multiple smaller pieces together, a technique known as forge welding. But the seams are almost invisible, a testament to the unbelievable craftsmanship of the ancient Indian smiths who created it. At the top, there's an ornate, bell-shaped capital, and it's believed a sacred image, perhaps of the Hindu deity Garuda, once sat on its peak. But the most important clue to its origin isn't at the top. It's carved into its side. There's an inscription, a set of verses written in the ancient Sanskrit script of the Gupta period. The inscription sings the praises of a mighty king named Chandra, a powerful ruler who conquered his enemies and established a vast empire. For a long time, historians debated which King Chandra this was, but most now agree it refers to Chandragupta II, a legendary emperor who ruled during India's Golden Age. He was a patron of the arts and sciences, and his reign was a period of incredible innovation and prosperity. But the inscription doesn't just name the king. It says the pillar was erected as a Vishnudvaja, a standard of the god Vishnu, on a hill known as Vishnupada. The mystery is, there is no hill by that name anywhere near modern Delhi. The pillar was moved here, centuries after it was made, by a 13th century sultan who likely took it as a trophy of war. Its original location, and the reason for its creation, remains one of its many secrets. For centuries, the pillar was simply a local curiosity. A legend grew around it. Anyone who could stand with their back to the pillar and make their hands meet behind it would have their wish granted. This tradition, however, caused so much wear and tear that authorities erected a protective fence around it in 1997. But as modern science began to emerge, the pillar transformed from a local legend into a global enigma. How could it be? Early theories were wild. Some claimed it was made from a meteorite, as meteoritic iron often contains nickel, which can resist corrosion. But chemical analysis quickly proved that wrong. The pillar's nickel content is negligible. Others proposed that it was protected by some kind of secret ancient lacquer or coating, but microscopic analysis showed no evidence of any coating. The surface is bare iron. The most popular early scientific theory was that the unique climate of Delhi was somehow responsible. The idea was that the dry, mild weather created conditions that were just right to prevent rust. But this theory collapsed under scrutiny. Delhi's climate is anything but mild. It has a long, intensely humid monsoon season, with near 100% humidity for months on end. Furthermore, since the Industrial Revolution, Delhi's air has become thick with pollutants like sulfur dioxide, which dramatically accelerates the rusting process. The pillar has been bathed in what is essentially acid rain for over a century. It should be rusting faster now than at any point in its history, but it isn't. The mystery only deepened. Scientists from around the world took samples. They bombarded it with neutrons, analyzed it with electron microscopes, and ran every test imaginable. They were all looking for an answer to the same simple question: why doesn't it rust? They confirmed its incredible purity. They confirmed the absence of anti-corrosive elements like chromium or nickel. They confirmed it was just iron, an object that defied their textbooks, a relic from a supposedly less advanced age that was outperforming their most advanced materials. The pillar was a silent rebuke to the arrogance of modern science. It seemed to be guarding its secret jealously, but the secret wasn't in what had been added to the iron. The secret was in what had been left inside. A tiny, almost insignificant impurity, an accidental byproduct of the ancient forging process, had created a chemical reaction so unique, so perfect, that it formed an invisible shield against the ravages of time. A microscopic armor, thinner than a sheet of paper, had been slowly growing on the pillar's surface for 1,600 years, protecting it, preserving it, and holding the key to the entire mystery. This protective layer has a name: mythology. It's a specific crystalline form of hydrated iron hydrogen phosphate, and it is the single most important reason the pillar stands defiant against the centuries. Unlike common rust, which is porous, flaky, and actively invites more decay, mythology is the exact opposite. It's incredibly thin, yet dense and non-porous. It adheres to the iron surface like a second skin, creating a perfect, impenetrable barrier that seals the metal off from the corrosive effects of the wind and rain. It's not that the pillar can't rust. It's that it rusted just enough to form this perfect shield, and then the process stopped itself. It's a case of controlled, self-terminating corrosion. The pillar essentially vaccinated itself against its own destruction. But this just pushes the mystery one level deeper. How on earth did this happen? Was it a deliberate act of genius by ancient metallurgists who had unlocked a secret to rust-proofing that we've since lost? Did they know that by creating a specific iron alloy, they could trigger this incredible phenomenon? For decades, scientists and historians leaned towards this idea. It was romantic, it was compelling. It spoke of a lost golden age of science. The truth, however, is far more fascinating, and it's a story not of a single secret formula, but of a series of incredible, interlocking happy accidents. The story begins not in a sophisticated laboratory, but in the fiery heart of an ancient Indian forge. To understand the pillar, you have to understand how it was made. And the ancient Indian method for smelting iron was fundamentally different from modern techniques. Today, we use massive blast furnaces that reach temperatures well over 2,800 degrees Fahrenheit. At these temperatures, iron ore melts into a liquid, allowing impurities, a substance called slag, to float to the top and be easily skimmed off. This gives us the highly pure, refined iron we use today. But the blacksmiths of the 4th century didn't have that technology. Their forges, fueled by charcoal, couldn't reach those extreme melting temperatures. They used a method known as bloomery smelting. They would heat the iron ore with charcoal in a clay furnace until it formed a spongy, porous mass of iron mixed with slag. This mass, called a bloom, was then pulled from the fire, glowing red-hot, and hammered relentlessly. The hammering had two purposes: to compact the iron and, crucially, to squeeze out the liquid slag. But here's the first critical accident. You could never hammer out all of the slag. Tiny microscopic particles of it always remain trapped within the iron matrix. And this trapped slag contained the first secret ingredient: phosphorus. Modern iron makers would consider high phosphorus content a major flaw. It can make iron brittle when it's cold. They go to enormous lengths to remove it. But the iron ore used by these ancient smiths, likely sourced from the region of modern-day Bihar, was naturally rich in phosphorus. And their smelting process, because it didn't fully melt the iron, didn't remove it. This perceived impurity, this flaw, was the seed of the pillar's immortality. So now we have a pillar made of iron with an unusually high concentration of phosphorus trapped inside. For centuries, it stood under the open sky, enduring the cycle of seasons. And this is where the second happy accident comes into play: Delhi's unique climate. Delhi has long, intensely dry periods, followed by a short, sharp monsoon season. This cycle of wetting and drying is the engine that drives the chemical reaction. Let's follow a single drop of rain as it lands on the pillar 1,600 years ago. That rainwater isn't pure H2O. It's slightly acidic from dissolved atmospheric gases. As it sits on the pillar, it begins to do what it always does to iron. It starts to rust it. Iron atoms react with oxygen, forming iron oxides, the familiar destructive red rust. But on the Delhi pillar, something else is happening simultaneously. That same acidic rainwater is also reacting with those tiny pockets of high phosphorus slag trapped just beneath the surface. This reaction creates a minuscule amount of phosphoric acid right on the metal's surface. And this is where the magic begins. The phosphoric acid acts as a catalyst. It dramatically accelerates a different, more complex chemical reaction. Instead of just forming simple iron oxides, the iron, the oxygen, the water, and now the phosphorus begin to combine in a new way. They start to form that complex crystalline structure of hydrated iron hydrogen phosphate. They start to form mesowite. Now, here's the most beautiful part of the process. This isn't a chaotic, runaway reaction like normal rusting. It is an incredibly slow, deliberate process. The mesowite layer grows atom by atom. Each cycle of wetting and drying, each monsoon season followed by a long, hot summer, added another infinitesimally thin layer to the shield. The rain would provide the water for the reaction, and the subsequent dry heat would bake that new layer, making it harder and more stable. For this process to work, you need that alternating cycle. If the pillar were in a constantly wet environment like London, it would have rusted away in a few centuries. If it were in a perpetually dry desert, the protective layer would never have formed in the first place. Delhi's specific climate was the perfect incubator. It took over 3 centuries of these cycles just for the initial continuous film of mesowite to form. And for the next 1,300 years after that, it has been slowly, patiently thickening. Today, that protective layer is still only about 50 to 100 micrometers thick. That's thinner than a single human hair. A shield that has defeated 16 centuries of monsoons, pollution, and the relentless march of time is so thin it's virtually invisible. So the secret wasn't a lost ancient formula. It was an unintentional consequence of craftsmanship. The smiths weren't trying to make rust-proof iron. They were simply using the materials they had, phosphorus-rich ore, and the methods they knew, bloomery smelting, to make the strongest, most massive piece of iron the world had ever seen. They created a flawed material that, when placed in the perfect environment, performed a chemical miracle over the course of centuries. They didn't design a pillar that couldn't rust. They accidentally forged a pillar that would learn how to protect itself. But solving one mystery only throws another, perhaps even greater one, into the spotlight. We now understand the chemistry. We understand the why of its rust resistance. But what about the how of its construction? The science of the mesowite layer is one thing. The sheer engineering required to create the pillar in the first place is another. Remember, this wasn't liquid iron poured into a mold. This was made from solid, spongy blooms of iron, each weighing maybe 50 or 60 pounds. To create a single solid pillar standing 23 feet tall and weighing over 6 tons, that's 12,000 pounds, they would have needed to forge weld hundreds of these individual blooms together. Forge welding is the process of heating 2 pieces of metal until they are white hot, and then hammering them together until they fuse into one. It's a technique that requires immense skill. To do it on this scale is almost incomprehensible. How did they lift and manipulate these massive white-hot sections of the pillar? What kind of furnace could evenly heat a structure of this size? And how did they hammer it all together with such perfection that, Even today, under a microscope, it is nearly impossible to see the seams between the individual blooms. They created a single monolithic column from hundreds of smaller parts, and they did it so flawlessly that it looks like it was created from a single piece of metal. The chemical mystery may be solved, but the engineering mystery is just beginning. How they pulled off this monumental feat of fabrication is a testament to a level of skill that challenges the very limits of what we thought was possible in the ancient world. To grasp the sheer audacity of this project, you have to erase a few key things from your modern mind. Forget about blast furnaces. Forget about liquid, molten steel being poured into a mold. Forget about industrial cranes and precision machinery. The world of the 4th century Gupta Empire was a world of muscle, charcoal, and fire. A world where the absolute upper limit of what a furnace could produce was dictated by the strength of men pumping bellows. And this is where the mystery deepens into a paradox. Iron, as you probably know, has a ridiculously high melting point, about 2,800 degrees Fahrenheit, or over 1,500 degrees Celsius. To get a fire that hot, you need a blast furnace, a technology that wouldn't be invented for another 1,000 years. The best charcoal-fired furnaces of ancient India, even with teams of men working massive bellows, could maybe on a good day reach about 2,200 degrees Fahrenheit. That's impressively hot, but it's still 600 degrees short of turning iron into a liquid. So, if you can't melt the iron, how do you forge a single solid 6-ton pillar? The answer is a stroke of pure, unadulterated genius. You don't melt it at all. Instead, ancient Indian metallurgists perfected a process that seems like a clever workaround, a hack on the laws of physics. They created what we now call wrought iron, but they did it through a process known as smelting. They would build a clay furnace, pack it with alternating layers of high-quality iron or in charcoal, and light it up. For days, teams of smiths would work the bellows, forcing air into the furnace, raising the temperature as high as humanly possible. But they weren't trying to melt the iron. They were trying to initiate a chemical reaction. Inside that roaring furnace, the burning charcoal produced carbon monoxide gas. This gas would then rip the oxygen atoms away from the iron oxide in the ore, leaving behind a purer, elemental iron. But because the temperature was still below iron's melting point, it never became a liquid. Instead, it formed into a hot, spongy, porous mass of metal mixed with all the other impurities from the ore, things like silica, phosphorus, and other minerals. This glowing, lumpy metallic sponge was called a bloom. After days of continuous heat and labor, the smiths would break open the side of the furnace and, using massive tongs, drag out this incandescent, dripping bloom of raw iron. It was a moment of triumph, but the work was far from over. This bloom was not solid metal. It was a fragile, crumbly mass, riddled with impurities called slag. To turn it into something useful, it had to be consolidated. Imagine a team of master blacksmiths, their bodies slick with sweat in the searing heat, surrounding this glowing monster. They would immediately begin hammering it. Not gently. This was a rhythmic, violent, and yet incredibly precise assault. With every deafening blow of their sledgehammers, two things happened. First, the hot semi-molten slag would spray out like fireworks, purifying the iron. Second, the porous, spongy iron particles would be forced closer and closer together, welding themselves into a solid, dense block of metal. They would hammer, reheat, and hammer again, over and over, driving out more slag and compacting the iron until they were left with a solid, workable billet of high-quality wrought iron. Now pause and consider the scale. This painstaking process might produce a billet of iron weighing maybe 20, 30, or perhaps 50 pounds at most. The iron pillar of Delhi weighs over 13,000 pounds. They couldn't make one giant bloom. It was physically impossible. So they had to make hundreds of individual iron billets, each one forged from a bloom that took days of non-stop labor to create. This wasn't an assembly line. It was a monumental, months-long campaign of fire and force. Once they had this mountain of standardized iron blocks, they faced the next great challenge. How do you stick them all together? You can't use mortar. You can't bolt them. To create the illusion of a single seamless piece of metal, you have to make them one. And the technique they used is one of the oldest and most respected blacksmithing arts: forge welding. If you've ever seen a blacksmith at work, you've seen the principle. You heat two pieces of metal in a forge until they glow bright yellow-white, reaching a state that's not quite liquid, but is soft, malleable, and chemically eager to bond. At this perfect, incandescent moment, you pull them from the fire, press them together and hammer them. You hammer them with such force and precision that the boundary between the two pieces literally disappears. The iron atoms from one piece physically diffuse into the other, creating a single unified crystal structure. It's not glue. It's a true molecular bond. It is, for all intents and purposes, a single piece of metal. Now picture this on a godlike scale. The construction of the pillar likely began in a deep pit dug into the earth to provide stability for the base. The first massive billet, weighing hundreds of pounds, would be heated in a giant furnace until it was a blazing yellow. It would be hoisted out, set in place, and then the next heated billet would be placed on top of it. And then the hammering would begin. Not with one man and a hand hammer, but with a team of a dozen or more men, wielding massive sledgehammers, swinging in a perfectly synchronized percussive rhythm. A thunderous, ringing beat that was the sound of creation itself. They would work in a circle, their blows raining down, driving the two incandescent blocks into one another. Sparks would fly, the air would crackle with heat, and slowly and possibly the seam would vanish. Then they would do it again, and again, and again. Billet by billet, layer by layer, the pillar would rise from the ground. Each weld required the metal to be at a precise temperature. Too cold and it wouldn't bond. Too hot, and it would burn and become brittle. Each weld required the hammering to be perfectly even, to ensure a solid connection with no hidden voids or weak spots. This was a symphony of skill, strength, and timing. One weak weld, and the entire 6-ton structure could catastrophically fail. It demanded a level of project management and quality control that is simply staggering for the ancient world. Modern metallurgists have examined the pillar using ultrasonic equipment and have found the welds to be astonishingly solid. They can see the faint lines between the different billets that were hammered together, confirming this exact process. They see a masterpiece of fabrication, a vertical stack of hundreds of perfectly welded iron discs. It is a monument built not by pouring but by hammering, a column raised not by cranes, but by the coordinated might of human muscle. They solved the melting point problem by sidestepping it entirely, and in its place perfected a method of construction that was part art, part science, and part brute force. But here is where the story takes an incredible turn. This very method of construction, this imperfect way of hammering together hundreds of smaller pieces, each one containing tiny, unavoidable remnants of slag, is the exact reason the pillar is still standing today. The solution to the engineering problem of its creation accidentally became the solution to the chemical problem of its survival. The very impurities they tried so hard to beat out of the iron are the secret ingredient to its immortality. How this ancient, laborious process created a passive, rust-proof coating is a scientific marvel even more impressive than the forging itself. So let's break down this scientific miracle, this happy accident of ancient metallurgy. To understand how the pillar defeats rust, we first have to understand the enemy itself. Rust or iron oxide isn't some disease that attacks metal. It's the metal's natural state. Iron is forged from or ripped from the earth and purified with fire. From the moment it cools, it wants to go back. It wants to return to a more stable, earthy form. All it needs is a little encouragement from oxygen and water. That's the battle every piece of iron on earth is fighting, every second of every day. And it's a battle that iron almost always loses. The secret to the Delhi pillar's victory lies in a 3-part harmony, a perfect storm of chemistry created by its ancient smiths. The first and most critical element is phosphorus. This is the secret ingredient we mentioned, the impurity that grants immortality. But the smiths didn't add it on purpose. They had no concept of elemental phosphorus. Instead, the phosphorus came from their fuel. They didn't use modern coke. They used charcoal, made from specific types of wood which naturally contained a high percentage of phosphorus. During the smelting process, as the iron ore was heated with this charcoal, a significant amount of that phosphorus was absorbed directly into the iron itself, becoming part of its very being. In modern steelmaking, phosphorus is a villain. It can make steel brittle. It's an impurity that engineers spend billions of dollars to remove. But here, in this ancient recipe, it was the hero. The second part of the harmony is the slag. Remember how the smiths hammered the iron, trying to squeeze out the glassy, rocky impurities? Well, they weren't entirely successful, because their furnace fires couldn't reach the scorching temperatures of a modern blast furnace. The iron never fully melted into a liquid. It was always a spongy, semi-solid mass called a bloom. This meant that microscopic, Thread-like particles of slag remain trapped inside the iron, no matter how hard they hammered. For centuries, metallurgists viewed these slag inclusions as a flaw, a sign of a primitive process. They were wrong. These tiny glass-like veins running through the pillar are not a weakness. They are a vital part of its defense system. Now for the third and final element, the environment. The specific weather patterns of Delhi, with its distinct wet and dry seasons, its humid monsoons followed by long periods of hot, dry air. This cycle of wetting and drying is the trigger that activates the pillar's superpower. Here's how the magic happens. When a droplet of rain or dew lands on the pillar's surface, the battle begins. Normally, the water would act as a bridge, allowing oxygen to steal electrons from the iron, creating rust. But on the Delhi pillar, something different occurs. The water starts to draw out the phosphorus that's been trapped inside the iron. This phosphorus-rich moisture then reacts with the iron and the air in a very specific way. It doesn't create the flaky, orange rust we're all familiar with. Instead, it catalyzes the formation of an entirely different compound, a complex iron-hydrogen phosphate hydrate. Scientists have even given it a name, mythology. And this is where it gets truly brilliant. Mythology is not like normal rust. It's incredibly thin, we're talking just a few micrometers, thinner than a human hair. But it is also incredibly dense and tightly packed. It forms a passive, non-porous layer that adheres to the iron surface like a second skin. This invisible shield is so compact that it physically blocks water and oxygen from reaching the raw iron underneath. It effectively suffocates the rusting process before it can even begin. But what about scratches? What about wear and tear over 1,600 years? This is where the slag inclusions, the second part of our harmony, play their genius role. These microscopic slag particles act as a network of channels throughout the pillar. They help to wick and hold moisture against the iron surface, even after the initial raindrop has evaporated. This means that the chemical reaction that creates the protective mythology layer isn't a one-time event. It happens continuously. If the surface is ever scratched or damaged, exposing fresh iron to the elements, the slag inclusions in that area immediately go to work, drawing in moisture, leaching out more phosphorus from the iron, and instantly healing the breach by forming a new layer of protective mythology. The pillar is, in essence, a self-repairing machine. Its supposed flaws, the phosphorus impurity and the trapped slag, work in perfect concert with the weather to constantly regenerate its own rust-proof coating. The very things that should have made it weak are the source of its eternal strength. This isn't a coating that was applied to the pillar. It's a coating that grows out of the pillar. It's an integral living part of the metal itself. For decades, this was just a theory. A brilliant one, but a theory nonetheless. The man who truly cracked the code was a professor from the Indian Institute of Technology, Kanpur, named Dr. R. Balasubramaniam. He spent years of his life dedicated to this single object. He meticulously studied tiny, naturally shed flakes of the pillar's surface under powerful microscopes. He analyzed its chemical composition, recreated the atmospheric conditions of Delhi in his lab, and piece by piece he assembled the puzzle. He proved, beyond a shadow of a doubt, the existence and the function of this mythology layer. He showed the world that the pillar wasn't protected by some lost alien technology or a mystical ancient paint. It was protected by a profound, if accidental, understanding of material science. It's a process so elegant and effective that modern scientists are studying it today, hoping to replicate it for creating corrosion-resistant coatings for our own bridges, ships, and infrastructure. We are reverse engineering a 1,600-year-old mistake to solve a 21st century problem. But knowing the what and the how of the chemistry only deepens the central mystery. How did these ancient smiths, working with primitive tools and no written chemical formulas, manage to create a final product with such a remarkably uniform distribution of phosphorus? Getting that consistency across a 7-ton, 23-foot-tall structure is a monumental challenge, even with modern computer-controlled equipment. To do it by hand, piece by piece, is almost unbelievable. The chemical resistance is only one half of the marvel. The other half is the sheer physical achievement of its construction, the brute force and delicate artistry required to forge something of this scale that could stand for millennia. Because creating the rust-proof metal was just the first step. They still had to build the pillar. And this is where the story pivots from a scientific mystery to an epic of human engineering. Because knowing the chemical formula for rust-proof iron is one thing. Actually making a 6-ton, 23-foot-tall monument out of it in the 5th century is a completely different universe of challenges. We have to erase our modern minds. Forget about giant roaring blast furnaces that liquefy tons of iron ore at a time. Forget about automated assembly lines, hydraulic presses, and cranes that can lift city buses. The world of the 5th century Indian blacksmith, or lohar, was a world of clay, charcoal, and muscle. Their tools were hammers, tongs, and an almost supernatural understanding of their materials. So how did they do it? The evidence overwhelmingly points to a technique called forge welding. And if you've ever seen a blacksmith at work, you've seen the basic principle. You take two pieces of metal, you heat them in a forge until they're glowing bright yellow-white, almost sparkling. At this temperature, the iron isn't liquid, but it's not truly solid either. It's in a plastic, malleable state. You then pull the pieces out, lay them on top of each other, and hammer them together with force and precision. If you do it right, the boundary between the two pieces literally disappears. The atoms of one piece bond with the atoms of the other, and they become a single solid object. It's metallurgy's original magic trick. Now imagine doing that on the scale of the Delhi pillar. You can't just find a 6-ton chunk of iron. It doesn't exist. You have to build it piece by agonizing piece. The process started small, in hundreds of humble clay furnaces. These were likely small, chimney-like structures packed with alternating layers of iron ore and charcoal. A team of men would work bellows, often for hours on end, forcing air into the furnace to get the fire hot enough, not to melt the iron, but to trigger a chemical reaction that separates the iron from the oxygen in the ore. What came out of the bottom of this furnace wasn't a neat, liquid metal. It was a spongy, ugly lump of iron mixed with impurities and slag, called a bloom. Each bloom might weigh anywhere from 20 to maybe 50 pounds. This is the first critical step. While the bloom was still glowing hot, a team of blacksmiths would descend on it with hammers, pounding it relentlessly. This wasn't just to shape it, it was to squeeze out the liquid slag like wringing water from a sponge. And as we now know, this violent manual process was the key. By not getting the furnace hot enough to fully separate all the impurities, and by hammering rather than casting, they were unintentionally trapping that phosphorus-rich material within the iron's grain structure, setting the stage for its future invincibility. So they have one 50-pound bloom of high phosphorus iron. Great. Now do it again. And again. And again. Let's do some rough math. The pillar weighs about 12,000 pounds. If we assume they were able to produce large 50-pound blooms, they would have needed to successfully create and process at least 240 of them. 240 successful forging operations. To get that much iron, they would have needed to mine and transport over 20 tons of high-quality iron ore. And to fuel the fires, they would have needed at least 30 tons of charcoal, which means felling and processing a small forest. This wasn't the work of a single blacksmith in a quiet village. This was a massive state-sponsored industrial project. Picture it: a sprawling complex, shrouded in a permanent haze of wood smoke. Dozens of clay furnaces glowing like angry eyes, each tended by a dedicated team. The constant, rhythmic roar of the bellows. The shouts of men coordinating their efforts. And the sound that dominated everything. The percussive, ringing symphony of hammers on hot iron. A sound that would have echoed through the valley day and night. This was an assembly line powered by human grit. Once they had stockpiled this mountain of iron blooms, the real show began. They would start at the base, likely laying a large foundation bloom. Then they'd bring the next bloom from the furnace, glowing white-hot. They'd place it on top of the first, and a team of strikers, huge men wielding massive sledgehammers, would begin the process of forge welding them together. This is where skill transcended mere strength. The master smith would direct the hammering with a small hammer, tapping the exact spot where the strikers needed to land their blows. It was a violent rhythmic dance. Tap-boom, tap-boom, a perfectly coordinated assault of force, delivered with pinpoint accuracy. They had to work fast. They only had a precious minute or two before the iron cooled too much for the weld to take. A bad weld, a cold shut, would create a weak spot, a flaw that could compromise the entire structure. If that happened, they'd have to reheat the entire section and try again, a monumental task in itself. So layer by layer, bloom by bloom, the pillar began to rise from the ground. It grew not in feet, but in inches. Each inch represented hours of back-breaking labor, and a level of metallurgical artistry that is hard to comprehend. We can see the evidence of this process on the pillar itself. Faint hammer marks are still visible, and close examination reveals the lamination lines, the ghosts of the individual blooms that were hammered into one. It's the pillar's birth certificate, written in iron. As the pillar grew taller, the logistics would have become a nightmare. They would have had to build scaffolding around it, and find ways to hoist 50-pound chunks of white-hot metal 20 feet into the air to be welded into place, all while maintaining the pillar's perfect vertical alignment and its subtle, elegant taper, which narrows from about 16 inches at the base to 12 inches at the top. This wasn't just brute force stacking. It was sculpture on a heroic scale. Finally, after months of this relentless work, the main column was complete. But they weren't finished. The ornate, bell-shaped piece that sits atop the pillar, the capital, had to be attached. This wasn't welded on. The smiths used a more sophisticated technique, one that speaks volumes about their advanced understanding of thermodynamics. It's called shrink fitting. They would have forged the capital with a central hole slightly smaller than the diameter of the pillar's top. Then they would have heated the entire capital until it was red hot. Metal expands when heated. The hole would have grown just large enough to slide over the top of the pillar. As the capital cooled, it would shrink, clamping onto the pillar with thousands of pounds of pressure, creating a bond so tight it's practically unbreakable. It's a technique modern engineers still use for fitting gears onto shafts, and these 5th-century masters had perfected it. What we're looking at isn't just a pillar. It's a testament to a lost age of titans. These weren't just men with hammers, they were scientists, engineers, and artists. Their knowledge of ore selection, temperature control, and forging techniques was passed down not in textbooks, but through generations of hands-on experience. Every square inch of that pillar's surface was touched and shaped by a human hand. Every molecule was fused together by human strength. They built something that shouldn't exist, using methods that should have been impossible, leaving behind a legacy of absolute mastery that has baffled the world for 16 centuries. And once this impossible object was forged, they faced an entirely new problem. How do you move a 6-ton, 23-foot spear of solid iron and raise it to the heavens? The answer, like the pillar itself, is a testament to raw, brutal, and yet exquisitely precise human ingenuity. Forging the pillar was a miracle of chemistry. Moving it was a miracle of physics. Imagine the scene. The pillar, still warm from its creation, lies on the ground like a fallen god. It weighs 12,000 pounds. That's the weight of a bull elephant, or 3 cars, and you can't just pick it up. There are no cranes, no hydraulics, no diesel engines. There is only muscle, wood, and rope. First, you need a road. Not a paved highway, but a cleared, flattened path, stretching from the forge to its final destination. Every rock, every stump, every major dip in the earth has to be removed or filled. This alone is a massive undertaking, requiring hundreds of laborers working for weeks. Then you need a sledge, a colossal wooden frame, built from the strongest timber in the kingdom, designed to cradle the pillar's immense weight and distribute it evenly. Getting the pillar onto this sledge is the first great test. Using a system of massive levers, essentially giant reinforced logs, and a whole lot of coordinated grunting, teams of men would have slowly, painstakingly pried one end of the pillar up, inch by agonizing inch, while others slid rollers underneath. These rollers, likely smoothed and greased logs, were the wheels of the ancient world. Once the pillar was nestled on its sledge, resting on a bed of these rollers, the real journey began. Hundreds of men, their bodies glistening with sweat under the Indian sun, would have pulled on thick, hand-woven ropes. Teams of powerful oxen, bred for their strength, would have strained alongside them. It would have been a slow, grinding procession. The sound would have been deafening. The groaning of the wooden sledge, the creaking of the ropes, the shouting of the foreman, and the rhythmic chanting of the pullers, a human engine keeping time. As the pillar inched forward, the rollers it passed over would be quickly grabbed from the back and placed in the front, a continuous, moving carpet of wood. Every foot of progress was a victory. Every slight incline, a monumental battle against gravity. Every turn, a complex, dangerous maneuver that risked the entire project. If the sledge tipped, if the pillar rolled, it wouldn't just be delayed. It could be cracked, damaged beyond repair, a sacred object desecrated before it was even raised. The entire operation was a masterclass in project management, a symphony of coordinated effort on a scale that is difficult for us to comprehend today. This wasn't just moving a heavy object, It was a state-level logistical operation, a demonstration that the Gupta Empire could command not just fire and metal, but the very landscape itself. And all of this was just to get it to the site. The real challenge, the act that bordered on magic for the common observer, was still to come: raising it. How do you stand a 23-foot, 6-ton needle of iron on its end? The most likely method is as terrifying as it is brilliant. First, you dig a hole, a deep stone-lined pit, precisely where the pillar is to stand. The foundation has to be perfect, capable of supporting the immense pressure without shifting for centuries. Then you build a ramp, a massive earthen ramp, packed down and reinforced with timber, sloping gently up to the edge of this hole. The pillar would then be dragged up this ramp base first. This time the direction of force is not just forward but upward. The number of men and oxen would have doubled, even tripled. The strain on the ropes would be immense. You can almost feel the tension in the air as the 6-ton behemoth is slowly, painstakingly hauled up the incline, until its base hangs directly over the waiting foundation. Now the pivot begins. The front of the pillar is anchored. The back, the top of the pillar is slowly lifted. This is where the A-frames come in. Imagine 2 massive wooden tripods or A-frames, taller than the pillar itself, positioned on either side. Thick ropes are slung over the top of these frames, attached to the upper section of the pillar. On the other end of those ropes are hundreds of men. Their job is to pull, in perfect unison, while another team uses immense levers at the base to guide the pillar into its socket. It's a terrifyingly delicate balancing act. The foreman would be screaming orders. The chants of the pullers would be a constant rhythm, the only thing holding chaos at bay. The pillar rises from the horizontal to 10 degrees, then 20. The wooden A-frames creak and groan under the incredible load, threatening to splinter. The ropes stretch taut as iron bars sing with tension. A single frayed strand, a single moment of miscommunication, and the whole thing comes crashing down in an instant. A catastrophe of shattered wood, snapping rope, and crushed bodies. But they don't fail. Slowly, degree by agonizing degree, the pillar is raised, a dark finger pointing toward the sky. Passes 45 degrees, the point of no return. Gravity is now its ally. With a final coordinated effort, it slides into its stone-lined socket. A deep, resonant thud echoes across the site, and then silence, followed by a roar of triumph. They had done it. They had raised a mountain of iron and balanced it on its tip. This incredible feat of engineering, this dance with death and disaster, wasn't performed in Delhi. Not originally. The pillar we see today in the Qutub complex was a spoil of war, a trophy moved there centuries later. No, this first miraculous erection took place over 400 miles away, at a place called Udayagiri. Udayagiri wasn't just some random location. In the time of Chandragupta II, it was one of the most important political and religious sites in the entire Gupta Empire. It's a complex of rock-cut caves, filled with some of the earliest and most iconic Hindu art in existence. These weren't just caves, they were temples, shrines carved directly into a living hillside. It was a place where the divine and the mortal met, and it was here, at the symbolic center of his kingdom, that Chandragupta chose to erect his impossible pillar. He placed it on a hilltop, right in front of these sacred caves. Why? Because this entire spectacle, from the forge to the final erection, was an act of profound propaganda. It was a message to every citizen, every rival king, every visitor who laid eyes on it. The pillar declared, without saying a word, the power of the Gupta dynasty. It said, "We can do what no one else can. We can smelt an iron so pure it defies nature. We can move a weight so great it defies logic. We can raise a monument so tall it defies gravity. We are the masters of this earth, and our power reaches to the heavens themselves." The pillar was a link between the king and the gods. Specifically, the Hindu god Vishnu, the preserver, the supreme being of whom Chandragupta was a devout follower. The pillar was a dhvaja, a victory banner, but not just for a military victory. It was a banner celebrating the triumph of order over chaos, of civilization over the wild, of the Gupta Empire's divine mandate to rule. They had achieved the impossible. They had raised a spear of pure iron to the sky, and on its surface they carved a message meant for the gods and for the ages, a message that would reveal the true purpose of this impossible object. The inscription, carved in the elegant Brahmi script of ancient India, is a poem, a song of praise. It speaks of a mighty king, a lion among men, whose fame was carried on the winds across the seven mouths of the Indus River. A king who, by the prowess of his arm, conquered his enemies in the Vanga countries, a region we now know as Bengal, and vanquished the Valakas in a great battle after crossing the seas of sand and salt. It speaks of a ruler whose glory was not fleeting, but was etched into the very fabric of the world, a fragrance of power that lingered on the southern oceans. The inscription calls him by one name, Chandra, and with that single name, centuries of mystery begin to unravel. Historians and scholars poring over this text have reached a near-universal consensus. The Chandra of the Iron Pillar is none other than one of the most powerful and celebrated emperors in Indian history, Chandragupta II, also known as Chandragupta Vikramaditya. To understand the pillar, you must first understand the man and the empire he commanded. This was not some minor regional chieftain. This was an emperor ruling at the absolute zenith of India's golden age. Forget what you think you know about ancient history. The Gupta Empire, from roughly 320 to 550 AD, was a civilization that rivaled, and in many ways surpassed, the Roman Empire at its peak. It was a supernova of culture, science, and power, and Chandragupta II was its blazing core. He inherited a vast kingdom from his father, Samudragupta, who was himself a legendary conqueror. But Chandragupta wasn't content to simply manage his inheritance. He was a man of boundless ambition. The inscription isn't exaggerating. He truly was a warrior king. He looked at the map of India and saw not borders but horizons. He pushed the boundaries of his empire in every direction. His most famous campaign, the one immortalized on the pillar, was against the Western satraps. For nearly 400 years, these descendants of Indo-Scythian invaders had ruled a wealthy and powerful kingdom in western India. They controlled the lucrative seaports, the gateways to trade with Rome, Persia, and Arabia. They were a formidable, entrenched power. Chandragupta marched his armies across hundreds of miles of punishing terrain, and in a series of brilliant campaigns, he did what no emperor before him could. He utterly destroyed them. He didn't just defeat them. He annihilated their kingdom, absorbed their territories, and took their silver. This single act transformed the Gupta Empire. The floodgates of international trade were thrown open. Gold and silver poured into the imperial treasury. The wealth that flowed into the kingdom was staggering, allowing for an unprecedented flourishing of art, architecture, and science. This wasn't just a military victory, it was an economic revolution. But his conquests didn't stop there. The inscription mentions the Valakas, a people from the region of Bactria, in modern-day Afghanistan and Central Asia. This means Chandragupta's armies marched across the treacherous Hindu Kush mountains, the same graveyard of empires that would humble the British and the Soviets centuries later, and projected Gupta power deep into the heart of Asia. This was a statement. It was a declaration that the Gupta lion feared no one. His military genius earned him the title Vikramaditya, a name that echoes through Indian folklore to this day. It translates to the son of valor. It wasn't just a title, it was a persona. He was seen as the ideal king, brave, just, and overwhelmingly powerful. He was the protector of his people, the vanquisher of foreign threats, the living embodiment of righteous might. And yet, to define him only by his wars would be a profound mistake. The Golden Age wasn't just golden because of captured treasure. It was golden because of what that wealth enabled. Chandragupta was a devout patron of the arts and sciences. His court at the capital city Pataliputra was legendary. It attracted the greatest minds of the era. Imagine a single court that was home to the equivalent of Shakespeare, Leonardo da Vinci, and Isaac Newton, all at the same time. During his reign, the great poet and playwright Kalidasa, often called the Shakespeare of India, wrote his masterpieces. His plays and poems are considered the pinnacle of Sanskrit literature, works of such profound beauty and emotional depth that they are still studied and performed today. This was also the era of Aryabhata, the astronomer and mathematician who revolutionized human thought. He proposed that the Earth was a sphere, that it rotated on its own axis, and he calculated the length of the solar year with an accuracy that is simply breathtaking for the 5th century. He gave the world the system of sine and cosine, and most importantly, the mathematicians of the Gupta period perfected the decimal system and solidified the concept of zero, not just as a placeholder but as a number in its own right. Think about that. Every single piece of digital technology you own, the computer you're watching this on, the phone in your pocket, owes its existence to a mathematical concept refined in the court of the very king this pillar honors. This was the world of Chandragupta II, a world of epic poetry and precise astronomy, of breathtaking sculpture and revolutionary mathematics, an empire of unparalleled wealth, security, and intellectual ferment. So now let's go back to the pillar. Why build this specific object for this specific king? It wasn't a tomb. Chandragupta wasn't buried there. It was a Dhvaja Stamba, a victory standard, a flagstaff. But instead of a cloth flag that would tatter in the wind, his flag was forged from the purest iron on earth. It was a symbol of his reign. Just as the iron was pure, so was his royal character. Just as the iron was strong, so was his army. And just as the iron would not succumb to the decay of rust, his fame, his glory, his legend would be eternal. The pillar was a physical manifestation of the idea of Vikramaditya. It was a spear of pure, unblemished power, raised to the heavens in defiance of time itself. It was a message not just to his subjects but to the gods and to the future. It said, "Here stood a man whose will was as unbending as this iron. Here was an empire whose brilliance will never fade." The craftsmen who built it weren't just showing off their technical skill. They were engaged in a profound act of symbolic creation. They were forging a legend into a tangible object. They were making a metaphor real. The king's eternal fame was now matched by an eternal monument. But the inscription leaves us with one final, tantalizing clue that deepens the mystery even further. It states that King Chandra erected this pillar, this standard of the divine Vishnu, on a hill known as Vishnupada. The name means the footprint of Vishnu. This would have been a sacred and prominent location, a hill chosen to elevate this monument so all could see it, a testament to the king's piety and power. And here is the problem. The pillar today stands in Delhi, in the Qutub complex. And if you look around, you will notice something very obvious. There is no hill. The ground is completely flat. So, if the pillar itself says it was erected on a hill called Vishnupada, a place of great religious importance, but it now stands on a flat plain hundreds of miles from the heart of the Gupta Empire, what happened? The pillar, this impossibly heavy 24-foot spear of solid iron, didn't just get up and walk. Someone moved it. But who? And why? And where is the hill of Vishnu's footprint? The pillar's journey, it turns out, is just as mysterious as its creation. The man most likely responsible for this colossal feat was a king named Anangpal Tomar. In the 11th century, around the year 1050, Anangpal founded the city of Dilika, the city that would one day become the sprawling metropolis of Delhi. And what does a new king building a new capital need most? Legitimacy, power, a connection to a glorious past. He needed a symbol so potent, so undeniable, that it would cement his rule in the eyes of his people and his rivals. Imagine Anangpal, hearing tales of a legendary pillar, a standard of Vishnu himself, erected by the great Chandragupta II, the Vikramaditya of legend. A pillar made of pure, unrusting iron, standing on a sacred hill hundreds of miles to the south. To possess that pillar, to uproot it from its ancient home and replant it in the heart of your new capital, that wouldn't just be an act of construction. It would be an act of appropriation. It would be a declaration that the glory of the Gupta Empire, the golden age of ancient India, now belonged to him. The Tomara dynasty was the rightful successor. This was a common practice in the ancient world. Think of the Romans, carting Egyptian obelisks across the Mediterranean to adorn their cities. Each obelisk was a trophy, a captured piece of a foreign god, a testament to Roman might. For Anangpal, the iron pillar was his obelisk. It was a Dhvaja, a victory standard, but he was claiming victory not over a recent enemy but over time itself. He was linking his fledgling kingdom directly to the most revered empire in Indian history. But having the idea is one thing. Executing it is another. Let's be clear about the scale of this challenge. We're talking about moving a 6-ton, 24-foot-long object across more than 400 miles of 11th century Indian terrain. There were no highways, no heavy-lift cranes, no flatbed trucks. There were forests, hills, rivers, and monsoon seasons. First, you have to get it out of the ground. The pillar was buried several feet deep, likely encased in a stone platform. This would have required dozens, if not hundreds, of men, carefully excavating around its base, chipping away at the foundation without damaging the pillar itself. Then comes the terrifying moment of lowering it. A 6-ton top-heavy spear of iron doesn't just gently lie down. One slip, one snapped rope, and it could crack or worse shatter. They would have likely built a massive earthen ramp, piling up soil and rock against one side of the pillar, and then with an intricate system of ropes, levers, and brute force from men and elephants, slowly, painstakingly, eased it down onto a series of rollers. These rollers were probably massive logs, constantly being moved from the back to the front as the pillar inched forward. The journey would have been agonizingly slow, a few miles a day on good flat ground. On difficult terrain, maybe only a few hundred yards. A special road would have had to be cleared and leveled ahead of the procession. Every river, even a small one, presented a monumental obstacle. They would have had to build temporary bridges, strong enough to support the weight of the pillar and the dozens of animals and men pulling it, or construct massive rafts for the crossing. Think of the logistics. The food and water for the army of workers. The blacksmiths needed to repair tools. The carpenters to replace broken rollers and levers. The whole operation would have been a moving city, a testament to the organizational genius of the Tom-era kingdom. It was a project that would have taken months, perhaps even over a year, to complete. And all for one single piece of iron. But where did this epic journey begin? The inscription gives us our only real clue: Vishnupada Giri, the hill of Vishnu's footprint. For centuries, historians and archaeologists have hunted for this location. The leading candidate, the place that fits the evidence best, is Udayagiri, a complex of ancient cave temples in central India, near the city of Vidisha. The evidence for Udayagiri is compelling. First, it was a major center of the Gupta Empire during the reign of Chandragupta II. We know he was there. There are inscriptions bearing his name carved into the very rock of the Udayagiri hills. Second, the site is filled with iconography dedicated to the god Vishnu, fitting the name Vishnupada Giri. Third, and perhaps most tellingly, archaeological surveys have found a large empty stone platform on the hilltop, perfectly suited to have once been the base for a monumental pillar. Geographically, it aligns with the probable conquests of Chandragupta. It was the heart of his empire. So we can picture it. This magnificent iron pillar, gleaming in the sun, standing atop the Udayagiri hills, overlooking the Gupta temples and the sprawling empire below. For over 600 years it stood there, a silent witness to the rise and fall of dynasties. Then, in the 11th century, the engineers of Anangpal Tomar arrived, and the pillar began its second great journey. When it finally arrived in Delhi, the entire process had to be done in reverse. Another massive ramp, another complex system of ropes and levers, another heart-stopping moment as hundreds of men strained to pull the 6-ton behemoth into a perfect, vertical position in the courtyard of a temple. And there it stood, its new home, a symbol of a new power. But the pillar's story of being a political symbol wasn't over. About 150 years later, the Tomaris were defeated. The Delhi Sultanate, a new power from the north, conquered the city. The first Sultan, Qutb-ud-din Aibak, began constructing his own monumental statement of power, the Qutb Minar, a towering minaret of victory. He built his mosque, the first in India, by tearing down 27 Hindu and Jain temples and using their carved pillars and stones for his new structure. It was a brutal and unambiguous act of conquest. And yet, he didn't touch the iron pillar. It stood right in the center of his new mosque's courtyard. He didn't melt it down, didn't break it, didn't topple it. Why? Because the Sultan understood its power just as Anangpal Tomar had. By leaving it standing, by incorporating it into his own grand design, he was making an even more profound statement. He was saying, "The power you revered, the symbol of the great Hindu empires of the past, now serves me. It stands in my courtyard. It pays tribute to my victory." The pillar had been co-opted once again. Its meaning transformed from a Hindu standard of Vishnu to a trophy of Islamic conquest. From Chandragupta's religious monument, to Anangpal's symbol of legitimacy, to the Sultan's trophy of war, the pillar has been a silent player in the epic drama of Indian history. It has been a witness to the changing of gods, the clashing of armies, and the birth of empires. Through it all, through the scorching sun, the torrential monsoons, the political upheavals, it has endured. While the temples around it were torn down and rebuilt, while the cities rose and fell, while the very languages spoken around it changed, the pillar remained. Unscarred, uncorroded, defiant. And this raises the ultimate question. We now understand its journey. We understand its symbolism. But we still haven't touched the core of its mystery. How is it physically possible? How did a 1,600-year-old piece of iron, forged in the fires of the ancient world, survive to the modern day without a speck of destructive rust? The answer lies hidden within the metal itself, a secret of ancient chemistry so advanced, it would take modern science centuries to fully understand. To unlock this mystery, we don't look for a magical coating or a forgotten surface treatment. The answer is not on the pillar but in the pillar. It's a secret ingredient, a ghost in the machine, forged into its very molecular structure. That secret ingredient is phosphorus. Now, in modern steelmaking, phosphorus is the enemy. It's an impurity that makes steel brittle and is meticulously removed in the fiery hell of a blast furnace. Modern steel is designed to be pure, uniform, and predictable. But the ancient Indian metallurgists who created the pillar weren't using blast furnaces. They didn't have the technology to completely liquefy iron ore. Instead, they used a method we now call forge welding. Imagine a blacksmith but on a colossal scale. They would heat lumps of iron ore with charcoal in a clay furnace until it became a spongy, glowing mass, a mix of iron and slag, the stony waste matter from the ore. This sponge iron wasn't pure. It was a matrix of metal riddled with impurities. The smiths would then take these hot, spongy lumps and hammer them relentlessly, folding them, and welding them together layer by layer, squeezing out much of the slag and consolidating the metal. Think of it less like casting a single block of jello, and more like making a complex piece of baklava, with thousands of paper-thin layers hammered into one. This process was an art form, but it had a critical, and perhaps unintentional, consequence. It didn't get hot enough to burn off all the impurities, and the specific iron ore used in ancient India happened to be naturally rich in phosphorus. So as they hammered and folded, they weren't just shaping iron. They were trapping microscopic particles of slag, and crucially, a high concentration of phosphorus right inside the metal's structure. They had inadvertently created a unique iron-phosphorus alloy that modern industry actively avoids. And that mistake was the seed of its immortality. Here is the beautiful, almost poetic paradox of the iron pillar. The secret to its rust resistance is rust itself. That sounds completely insane, I know, but stick with me. When the pillar was first erected, it began to rust just like any other piece of iron exposed to the elements. Rain would fall, morning dew would condense, and the iron atoms on the surface would react with oxygen and water, beginning the process of corrosion. But then, something incredible happened. The phosphorus that was locked inside the iron sprang into action. As the initial layer of rust formed, the phosphorus within the metal catalyzed a secondary chemical reaction. It reacted with the iron, the oxygen, and the hydrogen from the moisture in the air to create a brand new complex compound. This compound is a crystalline iron hydrogen phosphate hydrate, known to scientists as White. And White is the pillar's invisible suit of armor. Unlike the flaky, porous, reddish-brown rust you see on an old car or a garden tool, White is different. It forms an incredibly thin, dark, almost black layer that is non-porous and adheres tightly to the iron surface beneath it. It's only about 50 micrometers thick, thinner than a single human hair. But this microscopic shield is so dense and so stable that it hermetically seals the iron underneath. Cuts off the supply line. Moisture can no longer reach the raw iron. Oxygen can no longer attack it. The rusting process, which had just begun, is choked off at the source. It stopped dead in its tracks. Think of it this way. The rust on your car is a destructive cancer. It's brittle and flaky. It breaks away, exposing fresh metal underneath, which then rusts, flakes off, and exposes even more metal. It's a runaway chain reaction of decay that eats deeper and deeper until there's nothing left but a hole. The rust on the Delhi pillar, however, is not a cancer. It's a scab. It's a self-healing skin. The initial wound of corrosion triggers the formation of this perfect, impenetrable barrier that protects the body from any further harm. The pillar's own rust is its salvation. It inoculated itself against decay. This process was helped by Delhi's specific climate. The formation of this protective White layer requires cycles of wet and dry. The pillar needed the brief monsoons or morning dew to provide the moisture to kickstart the chemical reaction. But then it needed the long, hot, dry periods for the water to evaporate and for that phosphate layer to cure and harden into its protective crystalline state. If the pillar had been erected in a constantly damp, salty marine environment like the coast of Florida, This delicate process might never have stabilized, and it likely would have corroded away centuries ago. It was the perfect material in the perfect place. So this brings us to the million-dollar question: did they know? Were the ancient metallurgists who forged this marvel aware of the sophisticated phosphate chemistry at play? Were they deliberately creating a self-passivating metal alloy? A technology that modern scientists would only begin to fully understand and replicate in the 20th century for specialized applications? The honest answer is, probably not, at least not in the way we understand it. They wouldn't have been talking about phosphorus catalysis or crystalline iron hydrogen phosphate. But to call it a happy accident feels like a profound disservice to their mastery. These weren't amateurs. They were the inheritors of a metallurgical tradition that was already ancient in their own time. They would have known, through generations of trial and error, which ores from which mines produced the most durable iron. They would have perfected their forging techniques, observing that iron worked in a certain way, at a certain temperature, for a certain time, resulted in a product that withstood the ravages of time far better than others. They were masters of the result, even if the quantum mechanics were unknown to them. They didn't need to know the why to perfect the how. They knew the recipe, passed down from master to apprentice, for creating immortal iron. They knew which mountain to mine, which wood to burn, and how to read the color of the glowing metal like a sacred text. The pillar isn't just a lucky break. It's the pinnacle of an empirical science, a craft honed to such a degree of perfection that it appears to us, 1,600 years later, like magic. They had created a material that actively works with its environment to protect itself. A dynamic living surface that responds to attack by building a stronger defense. It stands in stark contrast to our modern approach of brute force and purity, of stainless steel alloys and artificial coatings that eventually chip, peel, and fail. The pillar's defense is integrated into its very being. So we've unraveled the chemical secret. We've peered into the atomic heart of this ancient giant and found not a magical spell, but a level of chemical engineering so advanced it seems almost alien. But understanding the how only deepens the mystery of its legacy. Now that we know the secret recipe, what have we done with this knowledge? Can this ancient wisdom solve some of modern engineering's most corrosive problems? The story of the iron pillar is not just about the past. It's about what this 1,600-year-old sentinel can teach us about building a more durable future. This is the fundamental question that bridges the ancient world with our own. The answer, like the pillar itself, is layered and complex. We couldn't, for example, build a modern skyscraper using ancient forge welding techniques. The sheer scale, speed, and cost requirements of modern construction make it completely impractical. Imagine the manpower, the time, the thousands of individual fires needed to forge every single girder of the Empire State Building. It's an economic and logistical impossibility. Our world is built on the mass production of standardized steel, a process optimized for efficiency, not necessarily for eternal life. We produce millions of tons a year, a scale the Gupta-era smiths could never have conceived. But that's the wrong way to look at it. The lesson of the iron pillar isn't about copying its methods, but about understanding its principles. The true genius lies in that passive protective film, the idea of creating a material that heals itself, that works with its environment to become stronger. This is the holy grail for modern materials science. Today, researchers around the globe are desperately trying to develop smart coatings and self-healing alloys that can mimic what this pillar does naturally. They are spending billions on nanotechnology and advanced chemistry to create surfaces that can resist the relentless decay of oxidation. Think about the implications. What if we could build bridges that didn't need to be repainted every decade at a massive cost? What if naval ships could ply the corrosive saltwater of the oceans without succumbing to rust? What if the steel rebar reinforcing our concrete buildings and highways had a lifespan measured not in decades, but in centuries? The annual global cost of corrosion is estimated to be in the trillions of dollars, a staggering 3 to 4% of the entire world's GDP. It's a constant, expensive, and losing battle against nature. The Iron Pillar of Delhi represents a ceasefire in that war, a truce signed 1,600 years ago. The knowledge embedded in its iron is not just an historical curiosity. It's a potential roadmap to solving one of modern civilization's most expensive and persistent problems. The ancient smiths, without knowing the chemistry, perfected the outcome. We, with all our advanced science, are still trying to reverse engineer their success. This forces us to confront a humbling reality about our perception of progress. We tend to view history as a linear path, an unwavering upward march from primitive to advanced. But the pillar stands as a quiet, powerful counter-argument. It suggests that knowledge is not always cumulative. It can be lost. Skills can vanish. Entire paradigms of understanding can be forgotten, buried under the sands of time, only to be rediscovered centuries later as a baffling mystery. The Romans created a form of concrete so durable that structures like the Pantheon are still standing, and seawalls built 2,000 years ago are stronger today than the day they were poured because they were designed to react with salt water and form new, strengthening crystals. We only just figured out how they did it. The Mayans developed a complex understanding of astronomy that rivaled their European contemporaries. The creators of the Antikythera mechanism built an analog computer of such breathtaking complexity that nothing like it would be seen again for over 1,000 years. The iron pillar belongs in this category of lost, or perhaps more accurately, divergent technology. The path its creators took was simply a different one from our own. Theirs was a world of master craftsmen, of knowledge passed down from teacher to apprentice, of a deep, intuitive, and holistic understanding of materials. They weren't constrained by shareholder reports or quarterly earnings. They were building for kings, for gods, for eternity. Their goal was not disposability, but permanence. Their work was a testament, a statement of power and piety intended to last forever. And in that, they succeeded in a way we rarely do. This pillar is more than an object. It is a witness. Stand before it and imagine what it has seen. It watched the golden age of the Gupta Empire, the very civilization that created it, crumble and fade into history. It saw the arrival of the first Islamic conquerors, who marveled at its existence and made it the centerpiece of their new mosque, a trophy symbolizing their victory. It stood silent as Tamerlane's horde sacked Delhi, leaving the city a smoldering ruin around it. It watched the rise of the Mughal Empire, witnessing the construction of the magnificent tombs and forts that define the landscape of northern India. It felt the shadow of the British Raj fall over the subcontinent, as engineers in pith helmets came to measure and study it, utterly baffled by its properties. It saw the struggle for independence and witnessed the birth of the modern nation of India on August 15, 1947. Dynasties rose and fell. Empires turned to dust. Religions swept across the land, and languages evolved and died. Through it all, the pillar remained. It is an anchor in the turbulent stream of time, a single unbroken thread connecting the world of horse-drawn chariots to the age of the smartphone. All the while, it has been carrying its message, a simple inscription celebrating a long-dead king. That inscription is a ghost, a whisper from a lost world, preserved on a medium that should have vanished centuries ago. The ultimate story of the Iron Pillar is a profoundly human one. It's the story of the unknown blacksmiths. We will never know their names. We will never see their faces. They were likely considered simple laborers, men of sweat and soot. Yet, with fire, hammer, and an incredible depth of knowledge, they achieved a form of immortality. Their legacy isn't written in a fragile manuscript. It is forged in 7 tons of incorruptible iron. They created a masterpiece that has outlasted the memory of the very king it was built to honor. For most people, the name Chandragupta II is a footnote in a history book. But his pillar is a living legend. So the next time you see a rusty fence, a corroded bridge, or a decaying piece of machinery, think of the Iron Pillar of Delhi. Remember that 16 centuries ago, a group of craftsmen created something that solved the very problem we are still fighting today. It serves as a profound reminder that we don't have all the answers, that sometimes the most advanced wisdom isn't found in the future, but buried deep in our own past. It challenges us to look at the world with a greater sense of curiosity and humility. It asks us to consider what we are building today. In our rush to build bigger, faster, and cheaper, have we forgotten how to build things that last? What will be our pillar? What monument, what piece of knowledge, what creation will we leave behind that will still be standing, still inspiring awe and wonder 1600 years from now? The Iron Pillar of Delhi is not just a relic. It is a question. It is a challenge. It is a testament to the enduring power of human ingenuity. It was forged in the fires of an ancient empire, tested by the winds of time, and it stands today, not just as a scientific marvel, but as a timeless symbol of a legacy that will never rust.